I hate the way people decide their top 25 rankings. And hate is a strong word. That's why I used it. I hate it. I despise the way we think about the order of the top 25. Drives me absolute bonkers. And I'll tell you why. It's because it's horrendously flawed. Horrendously flawed. If you were to look or think about virtually any other topic than the top 25 college football ranking and say, this is how I'm going to do this, you'd be looked like you're an idiot. Because on what planet does it make sense to say, because this team played another really good team, that makes them good? It doesn't. It's a really dumb way to decide who is the best team. On what planet does saying they played another team close, they beat another team, determine how good your team is? It doesn't make a lick of sense. How important is it that the other team you played had good players decides whether your team is good or not? Is dumb. When I was in college, there was a sentiment by the guys at the school that the girls at that school were not pretty. And that is not nice, but that was the way we thought back in the day, was that girl is a insert college town here 8, but she's a real world 5. It's not nice, but it's an analogy that I think fits here, because in what other aspect is the idea that, like, it's really difficult to judge how good a team is other than how good the other teams that they have played are? It doesn't make any sense. The fact that the kids that are good on Alabama means Texas is good? What? Huh? The fact that the kids at Clemson are pretty good football players means that Florida State is pretty good? I understand that the correlation there, and I am very hesitant to use to blame it on one source. But that idea of, because we've played other teams who are good, therefore we are good, is another example. And I feel like a conservative radio host when I do this, because they're just pounding the same topic over and over again. But it's SEC self-importance. That's all schedule talk is. They ain't played nobody, Paul. That doesn't determine whether I'm any good or not. If you picked Alabama up out of the SEC, plopped them in the Mountain West Conference, and gave them Boise State's schedule, does that have any effect on how good Alabama is? No. They're the same team. And maybe Alabama's not a great choice because they're not up to snuff this year. If you were to take Michigan and drop them in the Mid-American Conference, as they are, and say, hey, you are now in this conference instead of your old conference, does that have any effect on how good Michigan is? No. All it does is change the perception of how we view Michigan, because they're not playing Penn State, Ohio State, Iowa, etc. We just have a different viewpoint on them. But at the end of the day, are they any different based on the schedule they play? And the answer to that is no. It's objectively no. If Florida State got put in the Sun Belt, are they any different? I can use this analogy and use this hypothetical over and over and over again. Florida State's schedule, the teams Florida State plays has no bearing on how good or not good Florida State is. Do you know what decides how good Florida State is or isn't? Florida State. So the idea somehow, some way, that because LSU plays Alabama and Arkansas and Florida and whoever else you'd like to throw in that list, they are a better team is illogical. Playing good teams or playing perceptionally good teams and beating them has nothing to do with whether you are good or not. So, with that said, how do you decide who the best team in America really is? Because it might be a little bit more difficult than saying, well, they played so-and-so really tight, or they beat this team, therefore they're good. It's a little more difficult than that. But on here, the 5 best teams in the country right now, according to the Associated Press poll, are Georgia, Michigan, Texas, Ohio State, and Florida State. How do you decide who the top team in the country is based on those 5 teams? And I don't know that there's a great answer that's going to satisfy anybody, especially me, because here I am bitching about how everybody else decides who their best team is. But conceivably, the 2023 AP Top 5 should be based on 2023 success, right? If that is the case, how is Georgia number 1? I'll tell you how, because this isn't a perfect world, because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists with our biases intact, and that's okay. But what has Georgia shown you that leads you to believe that they are undisputedly the best team in America? And the same question persists with Michigan, Texas, Ohio State, Florida State, however far else down you want to go down the list. The same question exists. How do we decide who the best team in the country is? And I talked about this earlier in the season when one of my former radio co-hosts just hates preseason polls, hates them. And I was in agreement for a really long time until you kind of come to the realization that it doesn't necessarily affect all that much the actual polls later on in the season. Because if you didn't rank anybody, if the Associated Press, the first poll came out after this weekend, if you skipped all of September and brought it out in October, how much different is it going to be than Georgia, Michigan, Texas, Ohio State, Florida State? It's not going to be all that different. You might have Michigan at number 1 instead of Georgia if you hadn't ranked Georgia number 1 in the preseason poll. But the way that the poll is, the way I understand it, it's supposed to work, is that you're supposed to rank the top 25 teams this season, correct? Well, what has Georgia shown you that leads you to believe that they're number 1? Well, what about Michigan? I think it's the same question for Ohio State or Florida State. It's slightly different because Florida State beat LSU. Ohio State went on the road and beat Notre Dame. If you are only taking into consideration the 2023 teams, results, etc., and I've talked before about how teams are always going to get, especially championship pedigree teams like Georgia, back-to-back national champs are going to get the benefit of the doubt. But if you're strictly going by 2023 results, how is Texas not the number 1 team in the country? And even further than that, if you're strictly going by 2023 results, you can probably make the argument that Washington is the number 1 team in the country. Especially when you take out the idea of, but they've only played Michigan State and California. Okay. And you know what? They've looked real good while they did it. And they've got a couple of showdowns coming up where they've got games against 5 ranked opponents the rest of the way. They're going to play USC, Utah, Oregon State, and Washington State back to back to back to back to end the season. Washington is going to be battle tested. And I contend that right now, Michael Penix Jr. would win the Heisman Trophy if it was decided and was going to be awarded this Saturday to Michael Penix Jr. Don't win the damn thing. And I'm telling you right now that if on the back half of the schedule he continues to play, I saw this stat the other day and I was blown away by it, that in 4 games this year, Michael Penix Jr. has thrown 16 touchdowns, which is as many touchdowns as Iowa has thrown in their last 26 games. Michael Penix Jr. is tearing it up. And if he continues to play the way he has against Oregon and USC and Utah and Oregon State and Washington State, he's going to win the Heisman Trophy. That's a long way away, however. But if going strictly by 2023 results, which is how in a perfect world this is supposed to operate, how are Texas and Washington not number 1 and number 2? Ohio State has struggled at times and not played as well as you would expect them to. They only beat Indiana by 20. They had to come from behind to beat Notre Dame on the road. Have they looked like the best team in America? No, but you can see that the potential is there, and I think the same thing is true with Georgia. I think the same thing is true with Michigan, that at times you can see that through 4 or 5 weeks of the season, why somebody would view them as potentially the best team in America. But it's not supposed to be based on potential or previous success or anything like that, right? So how do you not, and I'll tell you how, because it would be unpopular, how do you not rank Texas, Washington, and USC as the best teams in America so far? Just because you put them there now doesn't mean you can't change your thoughts, feelings, and rankings later. And there are so many people that think you have to predict what the end of the season looks like before, like right now. You have to say, I think that Georgia is going to win their 3rd straight national championship, which history will tell you that that's probably unlikely. And the performance on the field right now would tell you that that's probably unlikely. That is Georgia the undisputed best team in America right now? The answer for me is unequivocally no. And yet, they get the benefit of the doubt, which they've earned. I can't complain about the fact that they've got the benefit of the doubt. I can complain about the thought process of, because they won the last 2, therefore they're still good. Like, no, that's not how it works. Or at least it shouldn't be how it works. Because what have they shown you that makes you think, I don't know who the hell's going to beat them? Because I'll tell you right now that if Texas and Georgia were scheduled to play on a neutral field, similarly to the college football playoff, this weekend, Texas would be the favorite. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Maybe that's a radical opinion. I don't know. I'm always frustrated by the way that poll voters look at the college football rankings, because you are trying to say, this is what I think is going to happen, instead of reacting to what has happened. And somebody is deathly afraid that if they say, I got Texas 1, Washington 2, Florida State 3, USC 4, Michigan 5, Ohio State 6, and Georgia 7, that they might have to answer and describe why they feel the way that they do. And that's the whole point of the poll, right? The whole point is to say, here's what I think. That's why you're being asked to vote in the poll, is because somebody has put enough value on your opinion to say, I care what this person has to say, and their opinion should matter at this. So then treat it that way. I don't think the whole point of the poll is to build consensus before you release the poll. The whole point of the poll is to get the consensus of a vastly wide array of opinions. And I think coming into the season, I thought, who's got a really good chance to be really good is Washington. And I think Texas has a chance to be really good. And at the time, I thought Texas Tech had a really great chance to be really good. Not maybe top 5 good, but still pretty good. And it's okay to admit you were wrong, because Nobody is going to get this right. Nobody is going to get this absolutely perfect. It is not possible and it is not expected, I don't think, to say that you are going to get 1 through 25 correct, because there is no way to determine that 1 through 25 is correct. But when you look at the top 5 teams right now, Georgia, Michigan, Texas, Ohio State, Florida State, if we were to start the poll tomorrow, is that the order that they would be in? Because I don't think that the answer to that is yes. Therefore, I don't like it, because there are teams that aren't getting their due that deserve to get their due. And I realize that it's still early and that there are still so many different things to shake out, and everybody, for the most part, is still healthy and doesn't have to worry about a lot of different problems that they will experience later on in the season. But that's what the polls later on in the season are for. Has Penn State looked as good or better than Michigan? Yeah. Has Penn State looked as better or as good as Georgia? Yeah. Yeah, they have. And yet, they're ranked 7th. In a time frame when we worry about and care about schedule and strength of schedule, which should matter. It shouldn't be the sole determining factor of how good your team is, but I will admit that it should matter. Georgia has played a schedule of nobodies. Most teams have played a schedule of nobodies. And yet, we still put all of this weight on schedules. And it doesn't make a lick of sense to me, because from about this weekend on, you have no control over your schedule. I just think it's such a dumb, ridiculous way to try to justify rankings and its SEC self-importance of, well, we've got 6 teams ranked in the top 25. Well, yeah, and the Pac-12 has 4 teams ranked in the top 10. And yet the 4 ranking slots they have are 10, 9, 8, and 7. So the idea that, and they're all going to have to play each other for the most part, that Utah, Oregon, USC, Washington all have to play for the most part one another, and they're going to get dinged for a loss here or there, or somebody's going to pick up 2 losses out of that group, and immediately it's going to be, well, we might have thought that Oregon was a little better than they were, and we had them overranked. They're not actually that good. You can have 2 losses and still be the 9th best team in America. You can have 2 losses and be the 3rd best team in America. But we lose sight of that so quickly with the rankings that the second somebody loses, you know what? Notre Dame could very well be the 2nd best team in America. And it very well could be that they just lost on Saturday to the best team in America. We have no idea, no way of knowing that outside of counting what happens on the field and using our eyeballs. We're all college football fans, right? We all know who looks really good and who doesn't. And I don't think it's that difficult to compare them against the level of competition that they're playing, going back to the attractiveness of college girls when I went to college. It wasn't easy. Like, just because somebody was a college 5, you could still compare that in your brain to what an attractive 8 looked like. You didn't need to go, well, compared to who else is here. That doesn't have anything to do with how pretty the other girls are, and it doesn't have anything to do with how good your team is. The ability, the talent level, the coaching, etc. of another team, in my opinion, has nothing to do with how good you are. And I just don't know that I'm ever going to get that across to anybody, because it's just been ingrained in you that, well, LSU is good because they lost to Florida State. Well, how in the hell does that factor into how good you are or aren't. LSU is good because they have a really good coach and they have really good players. And at some point this season, they're going to be playing at the peak level that they can play at. But that shouldn't matter going into college football games on September 30th. What LSU is going to be in November should have no bearing on what they are right now, and vice versa. I can't understand the thought process of the teams that Texas have played are good, or I think they're good, therefore Texas is good. No, Texas is good because they are playing football at a really high level early in the season with really talented players and good coaching. They are reaching their peak performance right now, and that's okay. And if Texas finishes 4-8, something changed, but that doesn't mean that they weren't great through the first month of the college football season. And I think it's that simple. It should be a week by week basis. And so many times somebody gets entrenched at number one, and the only possible way that they can be moved from that slot is if they lose. And I think you're seeing that right now with Georgia, because is Georgia good? Yes, unequivocally. And that is not the argument. I'm not trying to make a counter argument. I'm trying to tell you that has Georgia looked as anywhere close to as good as Washington has? No. Has Georgia looked as good as Penn State has? Yes, at times. But has Ohio State and Florida State and Texas and Michigan looked as good, or if not better than Georgia during the first couple of weeks of the season? Unequivocally. And yet, there's only one cemented spot that everybody's trying to get to, but the only way they can get there is they can't succeed their way to number one. And I think that's a really crappy situation scenario to find yourself in. And I don't know how to change it. This might have just been 22 minutes of me sitting here bitching about something that is unchangeable. I just think that for a group of people to decide here's who the top 25 teams are week after week after week, consistently be wrong, and then consistently be insistent that they know best, doesn't compute to me. And it's the same thing with the college football playoff committee. For a while, it was no number one ranked team had won the college football playoff. The team that the college football playoff committee said this was the best one consistently failed to play out to be the best one. So then why do we continue to trust them to be the ones who decide who play for the college football playoff? They hadn't gotten it right yet. Now it's changed a little bit, but still the question remains, the question persists. And I think the only reason it remains is because there's not a logical, easy, simple answer outside of deciding it by computers. But I don't think that's a path anybody wants to go back down. But I do think that that's the next step of the college football playoff, if I'm just giving you honest hot takery, is that we get to the 12-team playoff, and the first time that number 13 is a blue blood and gets left out, it's going to be, we need to take the bias out of this. Let's get back to computers. And maybe that's the best of both worlds. The computers decide who the top 12 teams are, and we'll go from there. I don't know. But I just know that there's no great way to rank the top 25 teams outside of having the cojones to say, you know what? I don't think Georgia's that great. But it's always fearful to bet against a team that's won back-to-back national championships. And nobody's going to do it until they lose. Or at least nobody's going to do it boisterously, vehemently, whatever the case may be, until Georgia loses. The fact that there are 130 teams in college football who cannot succeed their way to the top spot in the eyes of the people that matter the most, I think is a real bad situation. And it's not great for the sport going forward, but that's the way it's always been. And I don't know that it's going to change anytime soon. That'll do it for today's edition of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you are watching on YouTube, give us a subscribe. Make sure you're getting all of our great content that we're pumping out here on Saturday Glory. If you're listening on the podcast, give a 5-star review, and we'll read them here on the show. I'll catch you back here on Sunday, recapping another big week of college football. Looking forward to it here on the Daily Huddle podcast on Saturday Glory.